community run. We're in what's called a hemlock hardwoods or hardwood hemlocks, whichever way you'd like to flip the terms. This was the most dominant forest system in the Northwoods pre-settlement. And it's made up of 4 primary trees. It's made up of sugar maple, yellow birch, eastern hemlock, and basswood. And white pine was a modest component of that. White pine was the 4th most common tree in the Northwoods. Eastern hemlock #1, sugar maple #2, yellow birch #3, then white pine. So white pine didn't dominate the Northwoods. This community dominated the Northwoods. We're in an old growth, one of the very few sites left that have some old growth hemlock hardwoods still in them. It's about 0.2% left of what we once had. This is rare. Rare is the classic hen's tooth kind of thing. So you're in a place that was what we all saw as immigrants coming here in the 1880s. This is what you saw, and usually you'd go, okay, now what? You know? And I always like to just simply say there was a lot of rape and pillaging by major lumber barons, but there was just us regular folks coming in here with a homestead and looking at this and going, I don't know what to do, you know? What would you do? And I just want us to have some empathy for the people 130, 40 years ago who walked into these places and needed to plant potatoes, you know? You were gonna cut it down because you didn't know what else to do with it. So wood was in the way, and we cut down an awful lot of trees just to get them out of the way, and then we set them on fire because then you had to clear your field so you could plant. And wood was the way, meaning that wood was what you built everything out of and what you used for fuel to heat your home and to cook food on, and wood meant everything. The big white pines that were here, gosh, 30 or 40 years ago have pretty much died off. There's a couple big ones along the lake shore that we'll measure and show you. But these guys live 300 to 400 years, maybe up to 500 would be the absolute outlier. And these big white pines that were in this stand have apparently met their maker by and large. That was a big tree. Here's sugar maple. Sugar maple gets kind of old and gnarly looking. Same thing with yellow birch. Here's a big smaller eastern hemlock and a really big eastern hemlock. So those are our 4 species of trees that you're looking for in particular here. Here's a young eastern hemlock. So we mentioned yellow birch. This is a yellow birch that snapped off, undoubtedly in a windstorm. Yellow birch can live to be 300, 400 years old as well, so it's probably a couple hundred years old. And look at the roots that are above the ground. An awful lot of reproduction in an old growth forest takes place on top of stumps, on top of blowdowns, on what are called nurse logs, and we'll find some along the way, and or on tip-up mounts. When a tree blows down, you have this big, huge root ball, right? And those are great germination sites for the little tiny cone seeds of both yellow birch and eastern hemlock. They have wee tiny little seeds, and when they fall on all this forest leaf litter, they really have a hard time getting through. But if they can fall on top of an exposed site, they can get going, and in particular on top of a mossy exposed site, so like an old log laying on the ground that gets covered with moss. But then that stump or that tip-up mound or that nurse log rots away, and you end up with the tree standing on its toes, kind of like a little ballet dancer out here. This kind of looks like it might have been a nurse log coming across here. And I wonder about, was the nurse log this high up and this root going across the top? I don't know, and then it all eroded out from underneath it. I'm stopping here for 2 reasons. First, this big grandmother tree that was alive when I first started walking here 35 or so years ago, and I think it was alive until maybe 15 years ago or so. You wanna help me for a second? I got a diameter tape here. We'll just measure the diameter. Where's that baby hollow? Now, if it had the bark on it, it'd be a lot bigger yet. 42 inches. Pretty good. Pretty nice big old white pine. And you wonder why we cut them all down when you think how straight they are. And you know, 150 foot tall was not uncommon. 200 is what they say in the books that they got up to. This tree built Chicago, built St. Louis, built Milwaukee built all these places because it's 150 feet tall and straight up. And so we came through and we creamed these guys first right away, and then came back and when the trains got in here and took all the hardwoods after that. But I wanted to point out this ridge up here. This particular ridge was first occupied in 1500 BC. So that we're talking 3,500 years ago, there's been people living on this ridge, on this lake. And this is the site of the oldest known dwelling in Wisconsin. So this is the biggest white pine that I know of on this site that's still living. "41. Lungwort? It's a lichen you're only going to find in older stands of forest. Glad you asked. It's one of my favorite birds. You see that red that I just exposed? Yeah. Hemlock has 10% tannic acid in it. So we Europeans needed to tan leather. We've been tanning leather. We human beings have been tanning leather since 3,300 years ago. They found leather sandals in the Egyptian pyramids. So we figured out that when animals died, their skin could be used by we humans, and we figured out how to dry those skins and preserve them. So we've been doing it for a long time. So when we all came here in the 1800s, we needed to figure out what was the useful tree plant to tan leather, and what we found was hemlock trees. And hemlock trees were cut down by the tens of millions for their bark. Milwaukee led the world in tanning leather in the 1900s. Milwaukee was the epicenter, and what was the epicenter? Because, in large part, because of Chicago. And what was Chicago the epicenter of? Stockyards. So you had a gazillion hides just a little south of you, and you had this thing called Lake Michigan right there, where you could just put them on boats and bring them on up to the tanneries. It took one good size hemlock. These aren't particularly good size, but let's say they're decent enough to tan one hide. Anyway, this tree, the most common tree, was seen as this fabulous source of bark. We would cut it down and usually leave it to rot, because from a lumber standpoint, it was not considered valuable. Hemlocks were the most common tree in the Northwoods. They now represent about 1% of the Northwoods, is what I've read, is all that's left. They're a real finicky tree to grow. They like it moist, they like it north slopes, and then if they do get up here, the deer hammer them as a general rule. So they really have a tough time maintaining themselves. So these little hemlock glades like this are really pretty rare places these days. So underneath your feet, you're seeing hemlock cones. See all these little cones? So if you were to take the cone and open up each one of the cone scales, you're gonna find a little tiny seed at the base of each one of these cone scales. So this is, you get these big old trees. The hemlock can live 500 or more years. They can grow well over 100 feet. They can get really big. But you get these little tiny cones with these wee tiny seeds. And that's what we're talking about, needing these nurse logs, needing these open soil, but still staying moist kind of places to get these little tiny seeds going. If anybody's into wild foods, you need to graze a little bit of this stuff. Anybody want to try a little wood sorrel?
Wood sorrel.
Take a bite, chew it up. Want to try it?
What is it?
Wood sorrel. So this is a great little wild food right here.
How do you spell it?
S-O-R-R-E-L. It grows in old growth forests and should taste like lemon.
Like what?
Eat the leaves. Tastes a little lemony. Here's a big old tree that's now finally rotted far enough it's getting a little moss on top. I'd love to find a statistic, Bob, of how long it takes for moss to colonize a downed hemlock. Yellow birch growing right on top right here. 2 young hemlocks growing right here. So these guys will grow on top of the nurse log. It's nursing it through because all that moss will retain moisture in the dry summer, which we're having right now. Beautiful yellow birch here, by the way, young, how different it looks. So if you weren't familiar with what a tip-up mound looked like, here's a tip-up of a hemlock that's caught up in a tree. So it's got ways to go till it gets finally down on the ground. And usually these are good bear den sites. Bear can get in underneath a tip-up mound. So all this dead and dying trees, I write about it a lot in my old growth book. It's fabulous. We really have a hard time as human beings accepting death. But when a tree falls like this, you know, it's going to take a long time for that to decompose. Things will grow on top of it. The nurse log will support things. Wouldn't it be wonderful if when we died, things grew out of us so that we were beneficial in some way upon our death? And I think one can make an argument that trees in their death are often as valuable as they are in their life. Would you buy that?
Totally agree.
Yeah. And so we get all bent out of shape if a tree dies on our property. We've got to cut it down and get it out of there right away. There are 32 cavity nesting species in Wisconsin. We have 226 nesting species. Over 10% of our birds nest in cavities in dead and dying trees. The #1 species at your bird feeder is a black-capped chickadee. Where do they nest? Guess what? Cavities. They need dead and dying trees. If you don't have a dead and dying tree somewhere near you, you're not going to have chickadees as your feeder. So when a tree dies, are the birds applauding? Well, there's a whole cadre that are. They're going, yes, this is great. You know? Whole bunch of yellow birch. Finding the canopy gap, right? They're all attached. So this is a clonal colony of club mosses. People call these princess pines up here.
It's called club moss?
It's part of a family of club mosses, which there's, that's right. There's like 7 or so species of club moss in the Northwoods. They're spore bearers. They won't get any bigger than this. This guy could be 100 years old or older. I didn't kill it because what I'm digging up here is, it's hard to show you without, these guys are all attached via horizontal rhizomes. Can you see this going? So this guy's attached to here, is attached to there, is attached to that little guy, attached to that little guy. It's clonal. All these sugar maples. Look at all these little tiny sugar maples. Gazillions of them. You're seeding this area with as many as possible, and you're waiting for the one genetic one who can outcompete everybody else. That's just kind of awesome to think about. So we're walking into a northern bog, and all I wanted to do was point out the enormous elevational difference that we just went over. Maybe a foot of elevational difference, I don't know. It's pretty dry right there when we started, and it's really wet right here. And just pointing out that small elevational differences in the Northwoods make an enormous difference in vegetational communities. It kind of boggles my mind sometimes how this could be a bog and that can be a dry hemlock stand. It's just crazy.